The whole bus yard warned him it was a lost cause, but he didn't have anywhere else to go. A homeless veteran spent just $1 to take ownership of a broken, abandoned city bus, hoping for one final chance to rebuild his life. But when his loyal German shepherd began clawing at the floor beneath the dusty seats, they uncovered a hidden compartment that was never meant to be found. Inside it lay the documents and secrets that could restore everything he lost and pull his fractured family back together. What they found didn't just change his future. It changed the entire community that once turned its back on him. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always inspiring to see how far these stories travel. A gray winter morning smothered Buffalo in biting cold and restless wind. Buffalo, New York, where winter does not simply arrive but conquers, stretched out beneath a sky the color of old steel. Snow clung to every curb, every rooftop, every silent streetlight, leaning beneath the weight of the storm. The wind blew in sharp, icy lashes from Lake Erie, a wind that respected neither bone nor memory, and it sliced through the city like a reminder of how harsh life could be. Near the back of a neglected parking lot behind the interstate bus station, a rusted old pickup truck crouched against a stained brick wall like an animal trying to survive the season. Inside that truck lived Walter Hayes, age 68. His back had curved with the years more from burdens than age, and his once powerful shoulders, hardened by decades in uniform, now slumped beneath a faded military green coat. The fabric frayed at the cuffs, but Walter still wore it with a kind of reverence, as though the threads carried the last fragments of the man he used to be. His face was a map of time crevices, carved by the sun of foreign deserts, and the long, sleepless nights after he came home. Gray stubble covered his jaw, scattered unevenly, giving him the rugged look of someone who had stopped caring how the world saw him. Walter's eyes, deep set and troubled, held ghosts he rarely let surface in daylight. They were the eyes of a man who knew too much about loss. He had once commanded respect, once led others with confidence and duty. After deployment, after injuries, after layoffs, after the home slipped from his hands, Walter had become invisible to the world. Yet he was not alone. On the cracked passenger seat rested Ranger, his German shepherd. 6 years old, strong and broad-chested, Ranger's fur was thick with a blend of black and warm brown. His ears stood sharply alert, even when his eyes drooped with tired loyalty. A small scar near his left foreleg hinted at his own history of bravery. He had been trained to assist veterans with anxiety, a companion bred from loyalty rather than pedigree. To Walter, Ranger was not a support animal. He was family, the last constant in a life that had fallen apart, piece by piece. When the winter wind rattled the truck's failing windows at night, Ranger pressed his warm body against Walter's ribs, anchoring him through every tremor of memory and every breath that grew unsteady with fear. During the day, Walter worked the kind of small jobs that paid just enough to keep him and Ranger alive. He shoveled heavy piles of snow that crusted like ice armor over the pavement, hauled crates of passenger supplies from battered trucks to storage units, or helped carry luggage when the bus station grew busy. His supervisor, Frank Miller, a man in his late 60s built like an old tank with thick arms and a square jaw, spoke little but noticed everything. His thick white eyebrows sat low over eyes that had learned caution through years on the docks and bus yards. Frank wasn't warm, not in words, but his gestures were honest. When he nodded, it meant respect. When he gave Walter work, it meant trust. Frank knew hardship. People said he had lost his wife to cancer years ago, and some believed grief had dried his voice into gravel. But he never turned Walter away, never mocked his situation. That was enough to call him a friend, even if the word was never spoken aloud. Some evenings when Walter dragged his aching body toward the old truck, Frank would mutter without looking up, "Tomorrow at 6 Hayes." It was a lifeline disguised as routine. Walter understood that. But as night swallowed the bus yard, silence took control again. The truck smelled of old leather engine oil and damp wool. The cold crept into metal and bone, and every time Walter tried to sleep, shapes from the past rose from the dark corners of his mind. Gunfire, screams swallowed by sand, orders he followed, lives he couldn't save, faces he still remembered. Sometimes it was the loud memories, the explosions, the chaos, the crack of fear like lightning. Other nights, it was the silence after the moment when everything went still and he had to count who was still breathing. Walter would wake choking on air, hands trembling, trying to push away enemies that existed only inside his head. Ranger always noticed first. He would place one heavy paw on Walter's arm and stare with amber eyes that said, "I'm here." Those two words without sound kept Walter alive more than once. Each morning, frost clung to the truck's windows like a warning. You cannot stay here forever. Walter knew that. His joints screamed when he tried to stretch. Sleeping sitting up twisted his spine until knives of pain shot down his legs. He wasn't built to survive the street like younger men might be. He needed shelter, real shelter. But the world didn't hand shelters to men like him. Still, he rose every day. Ranger stood, shook the cold off his fur, and padded after him, as though guarding the most important soldier on earth. The bus station stirred slowly in winter. Buses growled to life, exhaust fumes mixing with the salt-stained air. Commuters appeared like ghosts, bundled figures rushing to warmth, never glancing toward the veteran and his dog. Frank greeted Walter with a grunt and a flick of his head toward a pile of crates. Walter worked without complaint, his breath forming little clouds that faded like unspoken thoughts. Ranger followed near his heels, scanning the lot like a silent sentinel. The rhythm of work grounded Walter. Lift, carry, breathe. Don't think. Just keep moving. But the peace always ended when the sun sank. As darkness reclaimed the yard and workers disappeared, Walter and Ranger returned to the truck. There they huddled once more, an old soldier and his steadfast guardian, fighting the same war that had never truly ended. Tonight the wind was particularly fierce. Snowflakes slapped against the windshield like icy fingers demanding entry. Ranger curled tightly against Walter's side, and Walter wrapped his thin blanket tighter, trying to lock out a world that felt determined to forget him. He traced the edge of his coat with stiff fingers, his name patch long faded, but the stitching still rough beneath his touch. He whispered into the dark voice, brittle, "I'm still here. I made it back." No one answered except Ranger, who lifted his head and pressed closer, giving weight to a man who felt lighter than the memories he carried. In this frozen city, surrounded by strangers who never took time to notice his story, Walter still held on to the simplest truth: someone needed him. And because Ranger needed him, he had to keep breathing, keep trying, keep pulling himself out of nightmares back into the cold but living world. Somewhere deep inside, a stubborn spark remained. A belief that maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe tomorrow he wouldn't wake up to panic. Maybe tomorrow Frank would offer a longer shift. Maybe tomorrow he would find a way to give Ranger more than shared scraps. But for now, Walter closed his eyes, listening to the distant buzz of a bus engine rolling into the station. Ranger exhaled softly. The wind howled, but neither of them moved. Survival often looks like stillness. Tonight, in the quiet confines of a rusted truck, a man and his dog clung to the last warmth they possessed each other. And though they didn't know it yet, tomorrow would bring a change unexpected, unbelievable, a chance waiting quietly just beyond the edge of despair. Tomorrow, an old forgotten city bus would appear not as a burden, but as the beginning of everything. Snow whispered down from a pale winter sky as Walter Hayes followed Frank Miller across the back end of the bus yard, Ranger pacing right at his heel. The air was sharp enough to bite bare skin, and Walter's breath came out in small puffs that vanished into the wind. He tugged his worn military coat tight and kept moving his knees stiff and crackling with every step. Frank walked ahead with his usual brisk, purposeful stride. He was a wide, heavy-set man, built like the side of an old barn, solid, unwilling to bend, his gray hair flattened by the cold breeze, his thick arms crossed behind his back. He hadn't yet explained why he'd called Walter over, or why he looked strangely serious this morning, but when Frank got that look in his eyes, you didn't ask questions. You just followed. They passed rows of buses in various states of decay, machines, once full of chatter and motion, now reduced to silent hulks. Their paint had long surrendered to rust, and their windows reflected nothing but the misery of winter. To Walter, each bus seemed like a ghost of a life people forgot to remember, and he knew well what that felt like. Finally, Frank stopped in front of a City Line bus once painted white and blue, but now peeling in uneven patches showing gray metal underneath. Its front windshield bore a web of cracked glass like frozen lightning, and the side mirrors drooped as if exhausted by time itself. Snow weighed down the roof in heavy clumps, giving the bus the appearance of a sinking ship in a frozen sea. Frank turned his voice low but firm. "Hayes," he said, scratching his chin where his beard grew rough and untamed. "You can't keep sleeping in that damn truck. Your back's already gone. The winter's only getting worse." He jerked his thumb toward the bus. "This has been sitting here too long." Owner vanished. Papers expired. I manage the yard, so now I decide what to do with it. Walter blinked through the cold, unsure if Frank was joking. Frank Miller did not joke. His weathered face told a history of hardship. Rumors say he had worked on these docks since his youth, survived a plant closure, and cared for a dying wife alone until grief turned him silent. That kind of loss changed a man. It made him wary of wasted opportunities and wasted lives. Frank inhaled deeply, his breath clouding the air. $1. And you take night shift security. Keep the punks out. You fix what you can, then it's your home. Walter stared at the bus. He felt hope push timidly at his ribs and fear shove right back. The truck had become his prison, but at least it was known misery. The bus was unknown, a risk, a chance. Ranger must have felt his hesitation, because the German shepherd suddenly leapt up the steps of the old bus. The dog sniffed the torn vinyl seats, inspected every rusty rail, then turned back with bright, expectant eyes, his fluffy tail lifting like a small flag of optimism. Walter's cracked thumb rubbed over the single dull coin Frank placed in his hand, a dollar that suddenly seemed heavier than gold. He nodded once slowly and pressed the coin into Frank's palm. "I'll do it," he said, voice hoarse but steady. Frank's serious expression softened into a satisfied grunt. "Night shift starts tonight." He dropped a single key into Walter's gloved hand and turned away. That was Frank's version of congratulations. When evening fell, the sky drained into a bruised violet, and the bus yard emptied of noise and life. Walter climbed into the bus ranger, trotting closely behind. The interior greeted them with the sour smell of mold and stale air. Ceiling fabric sagged, spotted with water stains that spread like damp continents. The seats, once upright and proud, leaned in strange positions, as though the bus itself had suffered wounds. Walter's first touch against the metal railing felt like a handshake with a survivor, dented, corroded, but still standing. The floor creaked beneath his boots, patches turning soft under pressure. He tested his weight carefully, like a man learning to trust the ground again. He dragged 2 seats together to make a sort of bed and folded his thin, frayed blanket over them. It looked pitiful in the vastness of the bus, but he refused to complain. He had promised himself he would not let pride or pity ruin this chance. Ranger curled beside him, fur brushing warmly against Walter's arm. The dog's ears twitched, always alert, even while resting. His presence was a shield against the cold, against the emptiness, against nightmares. Outside, wind scraped against the bus like wild fingernails. Snow tapped repeatedly on the cracked windows. Every draft of frozen air wormed through the broken seals, chilling Walter's bones. He closed his eyes, but darkness was dangerous. It opened doors to memories he spent years trying to weld shut. Sand whipping across a deserted road. Shouts swallowed by chaos. Blood darkening the dirt. A friend's hand slipping from his grasp. His chest tightened, breath shallow. His fingers clutched the old seat as though pulling himself out of a whirlwind only he could see. Ranger raised his head, nudged Walter's arm with gentle insistence, and then pressed his weight firmly against Walter's ribs. That warmth, steady, loyal, dragged Walter back from the places no medication or therapy had ever fully cured. Walter placed a shaking hand against Ranger's fur and whispered, "I'm here, buddy. I'm here." Minutes passed. The anxiety receded. Ranger's breathing slowed and deepened again, a calming rhythm like waves against a safe shore. Walter listened to it, matching his breaths to the dog's, letting each rise and fall remind him he had survived worse nights than this. He looked up into the wide cavity of the bus, dim, neglected, falling apart, and despite everything, a flicker of belief returned. This was more than he had yesterday. It was a roof overhead, a project, a possibility of reclaiming some part of his dignity. He imagined fixing the leaks, replacing the broken windows, rebuilding the seats into real furniture. Maybe even after years of drifting, he could create a home again. A modest, battered home, but one he earned with his own hands. His body finally relaxed into something close to rest. The cold still bit at his toes, but hope warmed the space between each heartbeat. Ranger sighed sleepily against him, and Walter smiled faintly into the dark. A man on the edge of collapse, and a dog who refused to leave him behind. Winter roared outside, merciless and unfeeling. But inside the bus, something fragile but real began to form. Not comfort, not safety. A beginning. And though Walter didn't know it yet, beneath one of the loose floor panels hidden just inches below where he now lay, waited a secret that would change everything. His bus, his future, his family, and the entire story he had almost given up on living. Tonight he survived. Tomorrow, the real miracle would start. Late afternoon brought a weak strip of pale sunlight over the bus yard, the kind of light that looked tired before it even reached the ground. Inside the abandoned bus, Walter Hayes stood with a damp cloth in his hand, his breath a visible cloud each time he exhaled. It had been several days since he moved into the bus, and the cold had not grown kinder, but the space now felt less foreign. Routine could tame even the harshest places. He no longer questioned why he was trying, at least not out loud. Ranger, his German shepherd, wasn't behaving like his usual obedient shadow. The dog kept circling around the middle row of seats, nose pressed to the rubber flooring, tail held stiff like a flag, sensing danger or discovery. He would paw the same exact spot, scratch lightly, then look at Walter with a low, impatient whine. Walter tried to ignore it at first, focusing on scrubbing grime off the handrails and collecting scraps of plastic from the torn seat covers. But Ranger wouldn't quit, not for hunger, not for commands, not for any distraction. Walter finally sighed with mild irritation and stiffly lowered himself to the floor. His old knees protested loudly in his joints. "What is it you're smelling, boy?" His fingers brushed the edge of the thin rubber mat. It lifted too easily, like something that had been disturbed before. Beneath it lay a grid of old wooden boards, weathered, yes, but one of them wasn't aligned like the rest. Walter pressed his palm against it and felt the board shift under his weight. He hesitated, pulse ticking faster with the thrill of curiosity that had no place in a life like his. Hands trembling slightly, he slid his fingers into the gap and lifted the board. It rose without resistance, and underneath was a narrow compartment, a hidden pocket of secrets sealed away from rot and time. Ranger sat back on his hind legs, tail thumping once against the metal seat leg as though to say, "See, I told you so." Inside the compartment lay a neatly tied roll of aged blueprints, edges curled, ink faded, but still legible. Walter unrolled them carefully. They depicted the bus in detail, every beam, every support, every electric conduit and water line. Someone long ago had planned to rebuild this bus right. Someone believed in its future. Beneath the blueprints was a bundle of documents, ownership transfers, registrations, city property records. They listed the bus's previous owners, including a final entry stamped "Relinquished" in sharp red ink. Everything was meticulously ordered as if placed there by hands that valued preparation. But the item that stole Walter's breath was the last packet, a stack of crisp forms bearing the seal of the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. Housing assistance programs for unhoused veterans. Step-by-step filing instructions. Lists of required documents he now held in his calloused hands. He sat back abruptly on a seat cushion, stunned. His entire body seemed to sag under the weight of the moment. Walter had fought 1,000 battles against paperwork, bureaucracy, and closed doors. He'd been turned away more times than he could count, not because he didn't deserve help, but because trauma stole his voice every time he sat in an office with fluorescent lighting and cold-faced clerks. His eyes stung without warning. "Ranger." His voice cracked through years of surviving instead of living. "You saved me again." Ranger leaned close, nudging Walter's shoulder with his warm snout, celebrating the discovery, as though he fully understood how life-changing it was. A soft knock startled Walter back to the present. Ranger growled low, not threatening, just alert. Through the grimy bus windows, a woman approached her steps, careful on the icy pavement. She appeared to be in her early 50s, tall and slender, wrapped in a long maroon winter coat, dusted with snow. Her white blonde hair fell from beneath a knitted hat, and her narrow face carried a kind of hardened sadness, the sort that grows after years of working around broken lives. She knocked again on the bus door. "Hello." Her voice was gentle but firm. Walter stood slowly, tucking the papers out of sight. He moved to the front of the bus and pushed the door open with a metallic screech. Ranger stood between them, watchful and ready. "I'm Martha Green," she said, offering a small, professional smile. She clutched a clipboard against her chest. "I'm with the Buffalo Community Outreach Team. We check on the folks living near transportation hubs, make sure no one's freezing to death." Walter noticed how her eyes flicked with silent assessment. His thinning beard, the worn patches on his coat, the dark hollows beneath his eyes. Social workers always saw too much, even when they claimed not to judge. "I'm fine," he muttered, tightening his grip on the door. "Got a roof. Got my dog. We manage." Martha's expression softened. She didn't step closer, respecting the invisible boundary some veterans place around their vulnerability. "If things ever don't feel manageable," she said quietly, "we have services, shelters, assistance with paperwork." Her gaze lingered as though she could sense how heavy that word paperwork was for him. Walter nodded stiffly. He didn't trust softness. Softness led to promises that fell apart. Yet as he looked at her, he realized she was simply someone trying to help someone who had seen too many people give up in winters like this. Before he could respond, a loud shout echoed through the yard. A teenage boy, bundled badly against the cold, sprinted past them with a stolen bag in hand, likely snatched from a bus passenger earlier. Ranger barked sharply and lunged forward. Walter grabbed the dog's collar just in time. Easy, buddy. Security guards from the station 2 lots over rushed past in pursuit. Martha sighed, her shoulders briefly sagging. That's the thing about this area, she murmured. A lot of people fighting the cold. Some fight each other. Some fight themselves. Walter's jaw tightened. He knew that last fight intimately. A radio call crackled from Martha's hip. She excused herself with a polite nod. I'll check in again soon. Please take care of yourself. She gave Ranger a soft smile before turning to help elsewhere in the endless winter crisis. Walter closed the bus door. Silence returned except for the faint hum of wind against metal. He went back to the hidden compartment, carefully stacking the papers into a recycled grocery bag he'd saved. These were not just papers, they were keys. Proof. A path home. Ranger rested his head on Walter's knee, eyes filled with expectation. Walter looked around the interior of the bus, again still broken, still leaking, still cold, but now it felt different. The bus wasn't a shelter of last resort. It was a project, a responsibility, a reason to stay alive. Maybe, he whispered, this is the second chance they forgot to give us the first time around. As night crept over Buffalo, Walter sat with a pen in hand and the application forms spread across the seat before him. Ranger lay at his side, lending presence and warmth. For the first time in a long time, Walter didn't feel like he was drowning. He was building something real, and the first brick of that foundation had been found beneath a loose floorboard, thanks to a dog who refused to let hope stay buried any longer. Snow drifted lazily outside the bus windows, soft flakes melting on the cracked glass before sliding down like tiny tears. Walter Hayes sat hunched over 2 mismatched seats he had pushed together to make his makeshift desk. The inside of the bus was dim, but daylight bled through the dull windows, just enough for him to see the paperwork spread in front of him. His pen hovered above a question asking about the years of his active service at the deployment dates he wanted so much to forget the injuries. He downplayed the names of comrades who never came home. Every line of text was a doorway back into the noise and smoke and panic of yesterday. His breathing would tighten without warning, his fingers shaking as though gripping an invisible rifle. But each time his hand faltered, Ranger pressed his warm muzzle against Walter's elbow or laid his large head gently across his knee, reminding him that he was here now, alive. Walter would take a steadying breath and force himself to write again. The process felt like carving memories into stone. He had spent years running from these questions, avoiding the walls of VA offices and the pitying eyes of social workers. He couldn't bear the humiliation of rejection, again being told he didn't qualify, that his trauma wasn't enough, his need not urgent enough. But this time was different. He had a roof, a tiny scrap of hope, and an animal who refused to let him fall apart. Walter ran his thumb along the edge of a thick envelope filled with guidelines about benefits he might be eligible for. Might. That word alone made his stomach twist. Ranger leaned closer, letting out a quiet breath that tickled Walter's wrist. All right, he muttered, half to himself, half to the dog. Let's keep going. Hours passed. The light outside shifted from gray to blue as evening crept in. Ranger suddenly lifted his head, ears pointed sharply. He released a low rumble of alert. Walter stiffened. Ranger rarely barked, but he always sensed someone approaching before they arrived. Then came the soft, uncertain knock on the bus door. Once. Twice. Walter's heartbeat skipped. He stood slowly, cautiously, and walked down the aisle. He unlatched the stubborn door and forced it open with a rusty screech. Standing on the icy ground was Linda Hayes, the woman who had once been his wife. She was 62 now, her once dark brown hair streaked heavily with silver and pinned loosely beneath a beige wool hat. Her figure, once slender and lively, had grown softer with age, but her posture remained straight dignity wrapped around tired bones. Her face bore faint wrinkles etched from worry and waiting, but her blue eyes still held a quiet intelligence that had always left Walter speechless. Next to her stood Mark Hayes, their only child. Tall, easily 6'2", broad-shouldered, dressed in a navy winter coat, zipped up to his jaw. He had Walter's deep-set eyes, but his mother's square jaw and strong brows. His short, dark hair was dusted with snowflakes, and a shadow of a beard darkened his chin. Mark had grown into a man while Walter was drowning in his own war. That guilt hit him like a punch to the ribs. Linda didn't smile. She looked over the bus, the broken seats, the warped flooring visible behind Walter, and when her gaze returned to him, her voice cracked ever so slightly around frustration and heartbreak. "We heard you're living in here," she said. "Sleeping in this bus." Walter opened his mouth to speak, but shame clogged his throat. Mark stepped forward, his jaw clenched tight. His voice was deeper than Walter remembered. "Dad, what are you doing to yourself? Every time you said things were temporary, it just meant you were slipping further." Walter flinched. He could handle cold. He could handle hunger. But the disappointment in his son's voice, that was a wound he couldn't bandage. Ranger sensed the rising tension, stepping forward, placing himself squarely between Walter and the two visitors. The dog wasn't threatening, no raised teeth, no growl, but his stance was strong and protective. He looked from Linda to Mark with calm eyes that warned, "Do not hurt him." Mark's sternness wavered. His gaze fell to Ranger. "He's protecting you," Mark murmured, eyebrows lifting with a mix of surprise and something softer, perhaps understanding. Linda's eyes filled with a tenderness she tried to hide. "Walter," she whispered, voice low, "tell us the truth. Please." There was no anger left in her, only fear. Fear that she might lose him completely one day, not to bullets or blasts, but to silence. Walter swallowed hard. His voice, when it came, was rough and uneven. "I'm struggling," he admitted. The words tasted foreign, heavy. "I'm tired, and I'm scared." He tapped the documents behind him with the back of his knuckles. "But I'm trying. I'm finally trying to do it the right way." He inhaled sharply, his shoulders shaking. "I don't want to fail again." Silence settled between them like falling snow. The wind outside whistled along the bus windows. Linda lowered her gaze, her gloved hands tightening over the strap of her purse. Mark's eyes softened. He stepped closer, but not too close, and nodded once, a gesture that carried so much disappointment, hope, and a willingness to meet somewhere in the middle. Walter's hands trembled. He wasn't used to being this exposed. When Linda spoke again, her voice held warmth beneath caution. "We can help," she said simply, "but only if you let us." Ranger sat back down beside Walter, leaning against his leg like a pillar of reassurance. The four of them stood in the doorway of a broken bus, and for the first time in years, Walter did not feel completely alone in the conversation. None of them pretended everything was suddenly fixed. The hurt between Walter and his family was older than the rust on the bus walls. It would take time to patch. But something fundamental shifted. A wall that had stood for years, built from pride, fear, and failure, cracked right down the middle. Walter stepped back slightly, allowing Linda and Mark to see the paperwork spread out on the makeshift desk. "Help me finish this," he asked, voice nearly a whisper. Linda nodded. Mark let out a slow breath that fogged in the cold air. Ranger thumped his tail once, as if promising he would stay on guard through every page Walter filled out. The moment wasn't dramatic, no tears, no grand reconciliation. But it was enough. Walter wasn't fighting the world alone anymore. The paperwork in front of him didn't look like an impossible war, just another task to be completed with steady hands and the right support. Night descended around the bus as the family stood quietly together, lit only by the dim glow of a lantern Walter had propped near his papers. Snow piled up outside, blanketing the darkness in white. Inside, warmth returned not to the air, but to the space between people who had once loved each other deeply. Ranger rested his head on his paws, content, certain he had done something important. And he had. Winter still raged outside, but inside the bus, just for tonight, there was peace. A pale morning sun stretched thin rays across the melting snowbanks of Buffalo, turning every icy patch into a sheet of glittering crystal. The worst of winter had passed, though the air still carried the bite of cold memories. Walter Hayes stood just outside his bus home, with a thick envelope clutched in his trembling hands, his breath visible in puffs of anticipation. The seal from the Veterans Assistance Office was already broken, and the crisp letter within confirmed what he had scarcely dared to hope for. His application was approved. The relief hit so suddenly that Walter pressed both palms over his face shoulders, shaking not from fear this time, but from gratitude and exhaustion. Buddy nudged his leg firmly, tail wagging just once as if to say, "We did it." The bus behind Walter, once a shell of rust and forgotten dreams, was about to become something else, something new. With the approved assistance, he could finally repair it, make it safe, warm, and truly livable. It was the first time in years he felt like his future existed beyond the next sunrise. Things began to move quickly. Frank Miller, with his gruff voice and unspoken loyalty, connected Walter with local professionals. The first to show up was Tony Russo, a thick-armed mechanic in his late 50s with olive skin and a salt-and-pepper beard shaved close to his chin. Tony's hands were permanently stained with grease, and his brown eyes carried a spark of humor under years of fatigue. He didn't waste time with small talk. He simply popped the engine compartment open and muttered, "This old girl's got some fight left in her." His personality was matter-of-fact and patient, shaped by decades of fixing things people thought were beyond saving. Next came Howard Clark, an electrician in his early 60s, with a narrow build, neatly parted silver hair, and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like a retired schoolteacher rather than someone who rewired entire buildings. Howard had a gentle disposition, speaking in calm, softened tones, often with a thoughtful pause before answering a question. Trauma didn't seem to reside in him like it did in Walter. Howard carried a warmth that suggested a life filled with harmony rather than conflict. Walter found him easy to trust. And finally, there was Luis Martinez, a plumber, whose laughter arrived before he did. Luis was in his late 40s, short and sturdy, with a round face and a trimmed black beard. His hands were strong but surprisingly gentle as he worked on the pipes beneath the sink. Luis always shared small-talk stories about his grandkids' favorite fishing spots and which restaurants in town served the best pulled pork sandwiches. His presence injected life into the bus, filling it with normalcy Walter didn't realize he had missed. Ranger remained the unofficial foreman of the project. He lay stretched near the entrance head, held high occasionally, sniffing each man as if performing background checks before approving their presence. Nobody questioned his authority. A single raised ear or slow blink seemed to signal whether a tool should be handed over or a step taken back. Everyone adored the dog, especially Luis, who insisted on sneaking him treats every time Walter looked away. Walter helped wherever he could. Despite the ache deep in his joints and the stiffness that slowed him down, he carried planks, sanded rough wood, tightened bolts, and swept away years of dust and neglect. Each physical act stitched his dignity back together piece by piece. The sound of drilling and sawing no longer echoed through emptiness. This was building, not decay. Linda returned the following week, bundled in a wool coat, cheeks pink from the cold. Her eyes still studied the bus like a stranger she wasn't sure she could trust. But her hands moved confidently as she scrubbed window frames and taped edges for painting. The lines in her face softened more each day she came. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was presence. And presence was a good start. Mark came too after work and school responsibilities allowed. He held himself with the awkward resolve of a man who has seen his father break many times, but chooses to hope for a different outcome. He hauled lumber-operated power tools, like he had been waiting for someone to ask him to all his life, and laughed, though quietly, when Ranger stole one of his gloves and pranced down the aisle in victory. The distance between father and son reduced not through conversation, but through shared labor, through paint under nails, through breath forming clouds in the same winter air. Weeks slipped by in the rhythm of rebuilding. New tires lifted the bus higher. Electrical wires hummed safely overhead. Warm lights flickered to life in the evenings, casting gold illumination across smooth flooring that replaced the rotted boards. Walls were repainted a soft cream, and well-used seats were reupholstered into a neat navy blue, each stitch a silent promise that this bus would carry life instead of loss. A corner near the rear became a compact sleeping nook with a bed. Walter built himself, wood-sanded until his tired palms could glide across it, without catching a single splinter. A tiny stovetop and a mini refrigerator transformed a cramped space into a humble kitchen. Ranger claimed the strip of floor by the door where he could watch the world and greet every visitor without moving more than a paw. Soon the inside glowed warm against the late winter gray outside. It no longer smelled of mildew. Instead, sawdust cinnamon from Linda's pastries and the faint chemical tang of fresh paint told the story of transformation. As the snow melted from sidewalks and Lake Erie wines mellowed, Walter looked at the bus one evening with a swelling sense of completion he couldn't fully explain. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't luxurious. But it was real. It was earned. It was home. With repairs complete, Walter no longer wanted to simply hide away inside the bus. He wanted it to move to carry purpose, just as he hoped his life would continue moving. So he came up with a small idea, modest, a bit fragile, but hopeful. Buffalo Bright tours, a gentle ride along the lake and through downtown, telling stories of city history, local legends, and the hidden corners only a lifelong resident would know. Parents stepped up with their kids after school. Retirees with coffee cups sat near the front, and tourists from out of town boarded with curious smiles. The heater hummed soft music played from an old speaker, and each trip had Ranger lying calmly in the aisle, soaking up pats and praise like he was made of pure kindness. Children adored him instantly. Adults said he had wise eyes. Everyone always thanked him at the end of the tour, even if they forgot to thank Walter. And Walter didn't mind. Ranger had saved his life more than once. If the dog wanted to steal the spotlight, he could have it. The bus wasn't just moving through Buffalo, it was moving Walter forward. Linda and Mark joined tours, sometimes standing along the sidewalk or waving when the bus returned to the harbor, their presence quiet but steady. The fractures of past years were still there, but instead of splitting further, they were filling in with new memories, layers of paint over old cracks. Walter stood behind the wheel one evening after the last tour of the day, watching sunlight slip behind the skyline. Ranger sat beside him, ears perked into the golden hour. The veteran placed a hand on the warm fur of his loyal companion and whispered, "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Ranger leaned closer in silent agreement. The engine hummed softly. The future hummed too. This was not the end of their journey. It was only the first smooth road after years of potholes. ChatGPT deny. Even the coldest winters of the soul can be broken by a single glimmer of grace. Walter's story reminds us that miracles do not always arrive with thunderfire or heavenly choirs. Sometimes they come quietly in the form of a loyal dog who refuses to leave your side, a stranger who lends a hand, or a family that takes one brave step closer instead of farther apart. God often works through ordinary days, through small mercies, through people and creatures placed in our path at exactly the right moment. If you are facing darkness, remember the same God who guided Walter through his slow and fragile rebirth is guiding you too. The light may be faint at first, but it grows stronger with every step you take in faith, with every act of love you accept or offer. May this story remind you that you are never abandoned. You are loved, seen, and cared for by a God who specializes in new beginnings. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far God's blessings reach. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss another story of faith, courage, and second chances. May God bless you, guide you, and keep you warm through every storm ahead.